but rather a move to buy time for the OECD negotiations. So I think useful to keep in mind that these tariffs are still on the table, and in November, we could very easily see the imposition of 25% tariffs on Spanish ham, or Turkish carpets, the whole list basically of products that the USTR has identified. The next slide, please. And so OECD negotiations, as I think everyone has alluded to, it's a multilateral process that is ongoing right now, and there are two pillars. I will not go into detail on this because I think Richard will probably cover this also. But except to flag that, if successful, this will result in a consensus-based international tax reform, which would help to, I think, address the key issue of the reapportionment of corporate taxation rights amongst countries, and also hopefully help to eliminate unilateral moves by some of the key players. So France, for example, has said that if there is an OECD solution that can be reached, they will drop their DST. In some other proposals, there is also a sunset clause to say that, okay, I'm going to put this unilateral measure in place, but if there is an OECD multilateral international solution, then this goes away. So, in July, as Professor Peng also said just now, there was some in principle agreement amongst the members of this inclusive framework to create a formulaic approach to reallocating tax rights, and also some new standards for Pillar 2 around minimum taxation. And this was, I think, in our view, a positive step forward, and Google has been very supportive of the progress that has been made on this front. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, WTO law considerations. I don't know how many of you are law geeks like me and Professor Peng probably, but just to go through, how this interacts with WTO law, and this is basically a really good summary of what Patrick has outlined in his paper. If you want to read more about it, please do read his paper in detail. But the key thing is that the DST issue has not been challenged at the WTO. So we don't know. There's no case law. There's no precedent. But from what we understand from GATS, and also taking the French DST example, there are certain tensions with some longstanding WTO rules. So the first one really would be the GATS, right? The General Agreement on Trade and Services. And that really comes into play when you're considering whether there is discrimination. So whether the most favored nation principle is breached, and whether national treatment also is breached. For the France case, the EU has taken very full commitments on national treatment in their GATS. So if you take the French case, then there can possibly be an argument that's made that the French DST is actually de facto discriminatory and in breach of France's GATS commitment in both in terms of MFN and national treatment. And then the second one, also there are possibly some claims to be made under market access limitations under GATS Article 16. So basically to say that you are by putting this measure in place, you are impeding my market access and sort of going against what you have committed to in the WTO. And then there is this whole issue of de facto discrimination, right? So what I mentioned just now, that on its surface, the French DST is not written to say, okay, this only applies to American companies. But even if there's no de jure discrimination, there can be de facto discrimination by the way this was designed and the way that it's going to be implemented, because it targets and it only affects a certain number of companies, and these companies all happen to be non-French, right, or happen to be mostly American. So there are sort of de facto discrimination arguments to be made here. And then this whole issue also about the likeness standard, right? So is digital advertising the same as traditional advertising? These are questions I think that will come into play if and ever this case goes before the WTO. And additionally, I think there are other factors to consider. For example, whether likeness exists across the modes of supply. Sort of tech neutrality in the determination of likeness. Whether there's a difference in the ownership of a platform, and ownership of content. So, for example, in the French case, Uber is subjected to the DST, but the French taxi company, which actually also operates using an app, is not subjected to it because the taxi company owns its own taxis. So questions like that will come into play, right? Ownership issues. Does it provide a sufficient distinction when you talk about likeness? And then also sort of factors on turnover, size-related cutoff thresholds, revenue thresholds. Can this possibly be justified in the GATS general exceptions? All unclear. And also finally, jurisdictional competence, whether this can extend to extraterritorial scope, right, of the French DST, also very unclear. So in short, I think very difficult to tell until and unless it's challenged in the WTO. But the bottom line is, even if it's sort of there's no definitive WTO case, it doesn't stop countries like the US from taking its own unilateral trade response and trade action under Section 301 of its Trade Act, as it has clearly done in the case of France, and also in many other cases that you saw in the earlier slide. Next slide, please. So finally, I think there is really a case to be made for a multilateral approach as the best path forward for all involved, given the international spillovers that unilateral action could entail, and the costs and fallout, right, of that. International trade fundamentally requires a consistent and predictable international tax system. And sort of no matter how trade is conducted, right, over air, over sea, over the internet, businesses really depend on clear rules of the road on tax, and also consistency across jurisdiction, right? So without an international tax system that provides this kind of predictability, it's very difficult for companies, right, whether a large company like Google, a small SME, to export, to do business in multiple countries without having their profits taxed twice, without being subject to discriminatory taxation. What businesses, I think, want at the end of the day is to be able to operate in an environment that is certain, that is coordinated, rather than to have like a fragmented regulatory landscape, right? Whether it's tax or trade across different markets. And so I think, it's clear that given the interactions between the overall global economy that is digitizing and the pretty archaic international tax system, there is a clear need for reform and modernization. But the fundamental point I think that we would like to make is that changes to the system shouldn't abandon multilateralism, right? It shouldn't come in a unilateral fashion. And it shouldn't then generate new barriers to trade and sort of hamper and dampen economic growth. So I think the OECD negotiations present a very good way forward. Not clear about whether a consensus can be reached, but I think at this point it's probably the best option on the table, and we really do hope that countries would succeed on this endeavor. So that's all from me for now. I'm happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eunice, for your very, very insightful speech. I like your point that the digital economy is just economy, and it's hard to distinguish which part of the economy is digital, which part is non-digital. I like that point very much. And sure, I share your viewpoints that it is very important for the governments to agree to a set of multilateral rules on trade and tax. We will have more discussion later, okay? And for our audience, please feel free to put any questions at this moment in the chat box. We will be coming back to you. Now we are turning to the implications for Taiwan, and Mr. Richard Watanabe. You are an expert on taxation, and to be totally honest, the details of the OECD initiative, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, it looks quite technical to me. So we would really like to hear your opinions and comments and your explanations. And I would also like to invite you to approach this topic from a particular angle. I mean, what are the potential implications of this global minimum corporate tax rate? What are your advice in this regard, for the local firms and the government? You will have 30 minutes, please. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peng. And obviously, again, thank you very much for to Taifu the invitation. And Eunice, thank you very much. It was an excellent, presentations. Obviously, nowadays I realize that trade lawyers or trade law specialists do start try to understand international tax rules. I actually next page, please. I actually started trade law back 30 years ago. I have an international trade law master degree. Back then, one of the conclusions that I had, and of course, given I also studied accounting, I studied trade law and international tax rules. But one of the conclusions I had back then was, trade lawyers do not talk to tax lawyers. These are two different streams. And reality-wise, yes, it was, the trade lawyers, how they talk to international tax lawyers, simply because in our world, we have direct tax and indirect tax, / custom duty, etc. But now I think this is a wonderful timing for trade lawyers, trade policymakers, and tax authority people sit down and discuss issues. And why? Because we have a new regime of a digital economy and obviously related discussions. As Professor Peng mentioned that what I'm going to present is something extremely, I want to use the word extremely, something relatively technical. So I will switch to the channel from English to Chinese. And let me present in Chinese to explain the relatively complex tax issues. 来，我们下一页好不好？谢谢。再来下一页。好，那我想今天我们简单的说明一下这背景啊。那我想各位也都知道，就是说我们传统上就过去20多年来，应该是从过去1920年代到可能到10年前，我想我们整个环境，我们整个法的制度，包括国际贸易法、税法的制度，它是以一个制造业、工业经济也一个获利。那我想大家都知道，就是它原则上就是说制造、销售这个无形，所以从这个获利架构来讲，其实无形资产或是 intellectual property， 它的贡献度相对是比较少。但你会发现，就是说从 Internet 这个事情，从 IoT 开始，从 AI， 我想从最近我们时常用的一个字就 digital economy， 我们在台湾叫数位经济啊，那我们大陆朋友是叫数字经济啊。但不管怎样，就是说它刚好现在是倒过来。它现在最大的获利来源是来自于所谓的无形资产 intellectual property， 以及更重要的，这个以前还没有，是最近10年比较新兴多出来的东西，就是 data 啊，也就是我们常听到大数据啊。那他认为制造的部分，其实我们刚刚讲说 GAFA 这几个公司，其实他们也都没有太多的制造，就算有制造，就算有制造，他们很多都把制造的function outsource 给其他的一个第三人。那他认为制造其实是相对 value added 或是价值增加的部分比较少，这第一个。那第二点当然是在知识经济之下，我们更强调的是 value proposition 所以我们叫价值主张。所以价值主张其实在现在这个经济体，不是说你产品多好，而是你的 data 或你的服务多强大我想未来的所谓的价值的主张或 value proposition 会是在无形资产的大数据，所以这个是非常基本的一个所谓的那个我们的经济伦理。那我们所有的也从现在开始要讨论的争议或者是 法律的制定，都会在这样的一个基础情况之下发生。来下一页。那这个当然，那个 Eunice 当然讨论到啊，我想最主要的数位经济的最后几个挑战啊，那最主要还是在于说，我们过去从1920年代啊，那个1920年代当然是我们在一战之后啊，那开始进入所谓的国际化的程度那我们有一个非常重要的 concept 叫 PE Permanent Establishment 他说或者是我们有刚刚 Eunice 也用了一句话，也是我们常用的，就是 physical presence。在这样的情况下，你在一个做跨国交易或跨境交易的时候，你有课税权。那么通常我们在讨论的时候，我们会有2个国家，一个叫居住国，一个叫来源国。居住国就是比方说我台湾人到新加坡去做生意那从新加坡那边赚到钱。那在这样的情况下，居住国就是台湾，来源国就是新加坡这有一个基本的一个分法。所以在这样的情况下，过去我们都是跨境做所谓的时候，我们另外一个在来源国，也就是用我刚刚的例子，我去新加坡做生意，新加坡政府有权给我课税的时候，通常台湾企业一定要在那边有一个所谓的 physical presence 或者是 PE。但是我想大家也知道，现在这个时代改了，现在都是云端来云端去有点像孙悟空在天上飞，你也不晓得那个到底在哪里，是第一个。那第二个，这个也有点好笑20多年前或30年前，我还在读书的时候，还有一个讨论。我们那个时候还讨论什么在开始有 Internet 这个时代，我们叫做有一个什么东西叫PE呢？那叫做 server， 叫伺服器这个 OECD 这是 OECD 的 rule OECD 说你在另外一个国家有伺服器或 server， 你就是在那边有 PE。问题来了，现在这个时代谁在用 server现在可能都是在 again 云端来云端去了。所以在这样的情况下，我想他会碰到各式各样的挑战，可能是所得税可能是营业税，或者是刚刚讨论到关税的问题。那关税问题其实简单来讲，就是说，其实很多情况下，关税很多是强调，特别是在强调是，我们在国际贸易法里头，我们会讲 trade of goods 跟 trade of services，关税是比较 trade of goods。问题来了，我们现在所谓资讯的交换、讯息的交换、data 的交换，甚至是 IP 的交换，严格上来讲，这都是服务业，很多都是 trade of services。那这个也没有所谓的服务，那这个要怎么课税呢？这个当然就是有一个非常重要的部分。那最下面也是有一个非常重要的讨论，就是 nexus 或者是一个关联性 coherence 或 nexus。我们现在很多交易呢，就是可以是我们以前在制造经济的情况下，你会还有上游、中游、下游，你还有 wholesale、retail 等等等等。那问题来，现在根本也不需要 wholesale 那或许连 retail 都不用那你等于就是说你在完成一个交易的时候，你可能上中下游，或者是 wholesale retail 零售业者，或者是所谓的批发业者，这个都非常模糊的情况之下，你根本所以一个完整的交易呢，我可能给它切个很多段，化整为零，所以它也没有所谓的关联性。在我们税的世界里头呢，关联性是非常非常重要。你没有关联性，严格上来讲，你是不能课税所以我想数位化经济或者是 digital economy， 就是说没有physical presence。2，我们要高度仰赖这个 intellectual property， 或者是所谓的 data 那第3个，不管怎样，我们都是高度仰赖所谓数据的交换等等在这样的情况下，就造成很多的挑战以及那个争议出现。来下一页。那这一页稍微简单的讲一下那当然并不是特别针对那个I'm very conscious 那个我知道 Eunice 的公司，我们当然也不要对号入座也不是在讲 Eunice 公司，但这个就是我们平常一直在讲是 GAFA 的企业，大家都有这样的特性我举个例子，假设一个T 公司当然不能用 G 公司或什么 F 公司我们就用 T 公司好。那它 T 公司它免费当然这个是不是免费有时候很多人男人世界时常讲说不用钱的最贵嘛，对不对？那其实这个并不是不用钱，我免费提供你消费者 Y， 那这个 Y 通常就是一般消费者。我提供你一些数位服务，可能是免费的搜寻，可能是一些免费的搜寻，当然它还有一些有偿的服务了就是云端储存等等。但是我想大家也知道，就是说你在运用这些免费的服务时候，你已经给他一个不用钱的东西，但是这个不用钱的，又回到我刚刚讨论，不用钱的东西是很贵的东西，那叫什么？大数据。那数据，那我想这个 T 公司收到大数据以后，它可能做各式各样包装那我想Eunice 刚刚也讨论到说，最典型的大概就是说，你要是有 我们在 B2B 的情况下，有一些商家他可能就跟你买广告做一些网络上的广告等等行销等等 那当然，我想这些公司会做各式各样的分析等等，然后提供一些，我建议你在什么样的情况登什么样的广告，或者是它有一个特定的族群替你登广告。所以登完广告以后，那当然就是说使用的商家在因为做了广告以后，他可以把所谓的服务或者是商品卖出去啊。所以这里头有非常大的一个重点，就是说等一下也会讨论 Pillar 1跟 Pillar 2。严格上来讲，它更大的 focus 会是在 B to C 的C 的部分，消费者部分。所以我们在这样的情况之下呢，以目前现在状况呢，以目前国际税法 International Tax Principle 来讲，严格上来讲，第一个 B 公司是完全没有所谓的这个市场所在国的 B 公司对不起，市场所在国的 B 国对于 T 公司所赚取的这些收益呢是没有课税权的，因为我们刚刚谈到它可能是在云端上进行那第二点更重要的是 T 国的T 公司的所在地 A 国跟 B 国可能有租税协定那第三个，所有绝大多数的劳务都在境外服务，也就在 A 国处理所以在这样情况下，这个提供消费者或者是所谓他赚到钱的这些国家，他是没有课税权的，这就是争议的开始那第二点，我们当然接下来讲就是说争议点第一点来说 ，B 国会主张说，wait a minute， 等一下，你在这边取得这么大的大数据，他认为这是一个有巨大价值，而且这是超额利润，这不是普通的一般的合理的，比方说 cost plus 成本加成的一个那个收入，而且我认为这个有巨大的一个超额利润。那第二个呢？当然，我还是强调，就是说，因为它是透过云端科技，我 T 公司在台湾对不起，在这个 B 国 ，T 公司在 B 国这市场的所在国，它并没有所谓常设机构或是 PE那第三个，严格上来讲，它的服务都是在境外提供等等等等。那第四个，要是我 B 国要主张要去课税的话，我这大数据的 value严格上来，我们刚刚讲说无偿，其实这是有偿，这个就是大数据，只是这个有偿的部分。只是这个现金，通常我们要用现金给的部分变大数据，那这个金额怎么计算那当然更主要的就是这些 T 公司可能它总公司可能是在美国或者是中国，因为我们讨论数位经济比较大的我们讲说领头羊或独角兽unicorn company 不管是 GAFA 或者是我们可能大陆有的阿里巴巴等等，我现在世界上想来想去，大概只有美国跟中国了但不管怎样，就是说我们在国际租税的情况下，我们刚刚又讨论到，我可以做一些租税上的规划安排，或者是一个化整为零的东西，把这些 T 公司的一些部分，特别比方说一些 function 跟那个function 或者风险功能跟风险搬到税率比较低的国家，也就是 A 国。那 A 国的低税率国家会不会造成它的其他这些 B 国的抗议所以我想这些就是给大家一个非常简单的背景，就是跟说明，就是说这个就是所谓的我们等一下会讨论到 Pillar 1、Pillar 2它的一个衍生出来的相对的讨论。来下一页。那我们稍微进步一点点，稍微讨论到就是说 OECD 有一个讲的有一个非常重要就是 value creation 那我还是要强调一下，很多国际税法上的制度是 OECD 在定。但你不要忘了一个事实 ，OECD 是一个有钱国家的巨人，它相对的 intellectual property， 它的无形资产，虽然我刚刚讲的，我们当然中国在最近几年是比较特殊但绝大多数所谓的高附加价值或者是所谓的这些 intellectual property 在经济实质上或者是资本的输出，都是 OECD 的成员国。那 OECD 就讲了一句主张课税的行为应该与经济互动，就是 economic activities 跟价值 value creation 要保持一致那但是其实本质上那这个当然 focus 在就是说你的这个贡献，你的 value proposition， 这一个所谓的 value 这个可能是 value chain 或者是 supply chain 或者是我们等一下讨论 digital economy， 我要看的是 contribution。问题来了，现在在 digital economy 的 contribution 绝大多数不管是品牌、技术等等的无形资产呢，绝大多数还是在所谓的 OECD 国家会相对会多一点，所以也就是说，在这样的情况，它的课税权会在 OECD 相对多一点。所以这样因为诉求不同呢，这个就是似乎开发中国家好像比较吃亏一点。那这个我们就还要讨论到，就是我们的未来的国家政策以及我们的税务政策等等，是不是包括以后的税制、法制等等，是不是更需要更强调所谓的无形资产的管理等等。这个我想也是给大家一个参考，因为未来的 OECD 的走法一定都是谁有无形资产，谁有创造贡献度，谁就有更多的课税权 好，来我们请继续。那这个大家看一下这个Eunice 也讲到大家防堵各式各样的跨国企业历史来下一页。那刚刚讲到一个 BEPS 那 BEPS 当然就是简单一下，就是说，其实说穿了，你要是看字面上 ，base erosion profit shifting 那 base erosion 这就是税基的侵蚀我们要缴税都要有一个所谓的税基了税基乘以可能是15%、20%、30%你缴税。那 profit shifting 呢，说穿了就是利润的迁移跟搬动。我当然利润要搬到哪呢？当然是从重税国搬到一个比较相对税务上比较轻税国。在这样的情况之下，在2013年，我要是没记错，2013年没错，2013年的时候，OECD OECD 这在 G20 国家开始在推的这个 BEPS 这个行动方案，其中最重要的一个重中之重就是所谓的 Action One。它的 Action Number 1就是数位经济人注税挑战。那当然提供一些 guideline 等等那不管怎样，就是说以后未来讨论不外乎就是除了这些也会从这15个 action 里再衍生出来以外，我想还有几个 principle 可以请大家注意一下。从左边开始，相关的税务资讯的透明度，所以等一下也会讨论到很多东西就是要求你纳税义务要揭露再揭露，大陆的讲法叫披露再披露。我要求你揭露更多事情，所以我才有办法去抓你是不是有逃漏税或避税等等。那第二个当然就是我更强调是实质的面的东西 ，economic substance 就是你不能滥用，你不能用形式我要求的更多的是所谓 substance 而不是 form 的东西等等，实质面的东西我要求更多。那第三个就是国际间的共同合作，所以大家会讨论到就是 BEPS 是 OECD 开始到 G20 等等。那等一下 Pillar 1、Pillar 2也是有将近130个国家的我们讲 IF 等一下我会再说明130个国家的共同合作。现在大家也看到说全球的资讯交换 Common Reporting Standard 也是超过上百个国家一起合作，所以我想这个东西一定就是强调3个主轴税务主管机关之间的合作、实质面的部分、经济实质面部分以及透明度未来台湾或者是国际间的税法的变更跟一个趋势，一定是朝这3个主轴进行下一页这个大概 Eunice 也花了很多时间在讨论就说数位服务那我也不想来，我们下一页那这个大法国很厉害了，法国自己搞了一套这样。但法国不是法国，我们台湾自己也搞了一套那各国的版本都不一样。那我们现在版本最多是欧盟几个国家UK 啦西班牙、法国等等，德国自己也有一套但不管怎样，就是说这个又回到上一页所讨论到，就是说这是另类这是另类的所谓trade law。来下来，请继续。那这个呢，我们也跟大家，我想在座也有税局的那个听众我想我们呢没有搞一个新的 DST。但是我们呢是在以台湾现有的税法的框架之下变了一个去做一些补强跟加强。来下一页那这个当然从2017年、2018年，然后强调当然就是说，第一个当然就是说台湾比较特殊了台湾还是非常强调台湾的课税的一个很多的 principle 都是以台湾中华民国来源所得或台湾的来源所得来进行变出来。第一个当然就是说你在境内有没有参与第二个说你的劳务抵公抵等等。那这个当然这是 yes and no 的，这个当然跟我们一般的国际的一个国际税的这个基本的想法也是相接近的。但是台湾是更强调有所谓来源所得，以及第二个，台湾是非常强调所谓扣缴的概念那这个跟所谓传统 OECD 还是不太一样。那大家也看到就是说 OECD 通常绝大多数国家都有签订租税协定，它的 focus 会在于营业利润以及固定营业场所营业代理，也就是所谓的常设机构。但是台湾还是比较 focus 在source of income。这个是台湾跟人家长得不太一样的部分那这个当然就是说，这个因为 Pillar 1、Pillar 2，台湾会不会再继续修法下去，我不是很清楚。但是我们台湾是自己有一套，就对于跨境电商的部分是有一套标准的。来，我们下一页这个大家看一下这个就是我们要有经济关联性，是否为台湾的来源所得等等，然后如何去课税的。这个大家这个都是在网络上都搜寻得到，请大家看一下来，我们下一页。好，那我想现在开始就是稍微讲一下，跟大家简单的说明一下，因为这个光这个数位税其实我在那个过去18年、19年在那个政大教国际税法那等于 现在有的这一套东西，差不多可以把我过去18年的东西全部颠覆掉。哦，那我想这个也是一个非常大的变化，包括我们在税务的从业人员啊，我必须要讲说，不是所有的会计师都会懂，就算是你是会计师或律师，你也要花很多时间读这个东西，你还搞不太清楚啊。这是我跟大家分享一个经验啊。所以我们从这边开始，这是一个时间轴。从过去来讲，我们很多人强调是 physical presence， 那这是1920年代啊。那市场价值 value proposition， 甚至 intellectual property 的这个存在呢，是被忽略到的啊。所以，然后那慢慢在演进来，所以我们跳过 BEPS 啊，从直接签到2019年了。2019年就是 OECD 开始正式在讨论，就是说我们的 Nexus 以及跨境的利润分配规则是不是要有一套的国际标准啊？我刚刚也讨论到，就是说自己都来很多国家自己有 DST 啊，所以有各式各样 study 出来，所以那个时候就有2个 two pillars 啊，有些人翻就说2根柱啊，2个支架啊，两个方针等等都没关系啊，英文叫 pillars。那第一个当然就是说 Eunice 刚刚也有讨论到，就是说其实就是让所谓市场所在国有一个课税权，也就是说我现在不是居住国，也就是公司所在地通拿，而是你收到收入的部分，我也要让它收到一些有一些课税权赚到一些钱。那第二个当然就是避免过度集中在所谓低税国。那我刚刚讨论到就是说有一些公司当然是。这个当然，会计师、律师也是共犯啊。我们也时常就是协助这些客户在如何降低你的税。但实际上，有些国家是有些国家我想特别是我们的报纸上时常谈到，包括爱尔兰等等啊，它可能因为有国家的政策，它也不一定是要为税收的问题，而是放弃税收，而是它因为国家发展的一个策略上的问题，它策略上的把那个税率降低，而吸引外资来投资啊，这些知识经济的公司来过去投资。就在这样的情况下，我们在我们的税的世界里头有一个，就是造成所谓的税务竞争，harmful 有害的 harmful tax competition。比如说，大家都是缺钱缺到很爆，但是有人就是把这些税收呢搬到包括刚刚讲的爱尔兰或者一些租税天堂国家。我想这个就是要避免所谓税制的限制。然后呢，那继续演算上说 ，Pillar One、Pillar Two， 等一下我再会说明一下，就是说它就包括一些企业也就是说。Pillar One 就是我有所谓的分享课税权的这样一个概念的情况下，适用于哪些客户大企业呢？就是第一个就是自动化数位的服务商，或者是所谓强调面向消费者。记不记得我刚刚一开始就讲说，我们 focus 在 B to C， 而不是在 B to B。B to B 这样从国际税来讲没有太大问题，都课得到税。但是从 B to C 的话，这才是可能是从税收来讲，主管机关的角度来讲，可能是一个新的挑战。所以它 focus 在是面向消费者上讲，这是第一个等一下也会讨论到。而且我还是强调说，这原则上还是大型的电商。那 Pillar Two 就是有关于避免你把这些税收都放在低税率国家这个是适用所有的企业，所有的大型企业那不一定是电商们的然后我们再继续那细节的部分，但在2020年10月有一些细节的出现我想最近大家比较就是今年度 G7 G7 在英国嘛，大家都知道，就是说第一个大家是承诺我们要推所谓的就是我们的 Pillar One 那个 Pillar Two， 那简单来讲就是全球 Unified Approach 我们统一的一个所谓的就真的数位课税，我们有一个统一的一个做法跟看法那第二个当然就是全球最低税负，那当然全球最低税负 G20 也通过了那个时候是定15%，然后再来就是回到就是包容性架构。那包容性架构简称 IF 了就是说里头其实我们刚刚一直强调，就是说在后 BEPS 时代呢，更强调是国际之间的合作。所以呢，严格上来讲，你或许觉得就是说，这个东西为什么要找这么多国家？反正有这种 GAFA 或者是大型的，好像也只有中国，也只有几个国家而已，干嘛给它扯那么多人？但实际上你不要忘了。现在的数位云端，或者是云端科技，或者是所谓数位科技，一定是跨国界的我相信不是130个，甚至180几个国家都会参与到所以大家严格上来讲的 Pillar One 跟 Pillar Two， 那我们的看法是2023年可能全面推行当然最近有几天，最近有一段时间就讲说，特别是第2点 Pillar One， 刚用反而爱尔兰对不对？爱尔兰或是有些国家可能会抗议就是说本来就是这样子，你不是要把我的经济给毁掉？那实际上，我现在听到的消息就是说，全世界现在130个国家里头，已经差不多125个国家已经 OK 了，剩下几个少数4个、5个、还6个国家，包括爱尔兰好像都已经 OK， 就针对这个东西要共同推动。所以现在已经很简单。当初大家很多讲说，特别是给很多租税优惠来吸引外资的发展中国家会有一些意见，但结论现在是大家都没意见。 啊，这个我想已经箭在弦上，已经上了。来，继续，来下一页。来，那这个就是一个很大的一个 summary 哈，给大家稍微讲讲。但 Pillar One 跟 Pillar Two 哈，就是说我刚才是强调 unified approach， 大家共同的就是对于电商如何课税啊，当然就是 Pillar One 哈。那第二个就是大型的，那 who 嘛 what 啊，那当然就是一个就是 unified approach。那第二个就是我们有一个新的名词叫 globe 啊，那 globe 其实就是一个就是 global anti 那个 base erosion 的简称了。那时间化原则上是目标是2023年全面实行。来，请继续。来，那我们来讨论到 Pillar One 跟 Pillar Two 哦，我想办法塞在一页啊，看得懂很好啊，看不懂那是正常的哦。那简单来讲就是说，我只是给大家一个概念，就是说原则上过去啊，它有分几个东西，就是说 Pillar One 最主要就是利益的共享，说出来这样子啊，利益的共享就是说我们在传统第二个，我这边左边有一些 amount A 跟 B 哈，大家先看 amount B 啊。这是有现有的课税权，也就是说，我们在所谓的居住国，比方说 GAFA 的所有国，当然或者是这个阿里巴巴，或者是拼多多，或者是腾讯的所在国，可能就是大陆吧，中国，他们有更多的课税权啊。那当然，在这样的情况之下呢，我想就是达不到我们的目的嘛，对不对？所以在这样的情况下，我们有一个共同的部分，就是它比方说所谓比较是 low value add 或是 routine function， 或是它比较用一个简化方法，我给你一个比例，让你赚一些，那剩下的部分我们通常实务上会叫做超额利润或剩余的利润哈。那当然，当我们所得来源国都会讲这是超额利润，因为你赚的太多了啊。但不管怎样，剩余的利润当然它会有一定的用贡献度，可能用 percentage 啊。当然还有很多细节要讨论。我这个新的课税权就让给所有的市场国家，说穿了就是利益共享。那我想可能有些人会问到，就是说，这美国赚到什么？美国怎么什么这些 GAFA 一定抗议到爆啊？怎么把我本来应该赚100块钱，还要分30块、40块，甚至是50块给这些市场国家？我还是强调一个问题啊，强调一个事情，就是说，刚刚 Unis 也讲了，就是说，其实，我要是将心比心，我要是跟 Unis 在同一个公司上班的话，一定很头痛。今天是法国，明天是德国，后天是台湾，大后天是有什么澳大利亚等等，你一定烦死了。所以这个我相信是一个 give and take 的，这个就是创造所谓的一个确定性。但不管是 GAFA 或者是所谓中国的阿里巴巴、腾讯或拼多多、美团等等，我想任何未来的独角兽或是跨境提供服务的所谓电商，是会给他一个所谓的一个确定性啊。那确定性的话，我想在这样的情况下呢，我想大家可以有更多的时间花在一个所谓的商业上的一个活动。那当然，它还是有保留一些争议的解决。当然，我们如何去分 A 跟 B 啊？严格上来讲，你只看这个，当然也是很伤脑筋，因为这些也是非常抽象的哈。所以在这样，它也提供一些争议哈，我们叫 dispute resolution， 一个 tax certainty， 如何去解决这些纷争的一个权利哈。那我强调，这些原则上就是大型的电商，原则上你要7点，特别是 amount A 这要分润的情况之下，你这个公司这个集团呢，原则上要7.5个亿，目前的看法是7.5个亿欧元的收入。所以你要是中小企业或小电商等等，我不要说不要，我并不是说你不需要去 care， 但是我相信这一方面对你的实际上经济上的影响可能是相对比较小的。来下一页。那 Pillar Two 的话就是全球最低税负全球最低税负目前的倾向大概就是刚刚讲到在 G7 的会议哈是讲到15%哈。那 again 就是会适用到那个最低税负的国家，就是说你这个集团或者在你这个所谓的来源国，你要缴到至少15%。什么样的公司会适用呢？这原则上就是你还是要大型企业，也是一样，7.5个欧元，7.5个亿欧元啊。那这里头有很多方法哈，什么 income inclusion rule， 我们简称 IIR switch over rule, under tax payment rules, subject to tax rule。我用最简单的几个字讲了啊。第一个当然就是说利润那个纳入的规则，就是说你要是到比方说台湾企业到新加坡去做生意好了那假设这个公司也是超过7.5亿，但是你在新加坡缴的税呢，只有缴到10%，而不是15%的话，那台湾的 home country 是有权补差额，我就给你抽了。但是但是这个东西大家就会开始 OS 心里就 OS， 所以有些国家，这个就是我们最主要争议的来源，就是特别是发展中国家，我把税率降低是要吸引外资来我的国家投资，要建设我经济对不对？那你现在等于是说我不课税，变成你所谓居住国这些企业的 home country 东道主国，不是东道主国，就是 home country 母国要去课税， 那不是变相的变成我发展中国家在补贴你已开发国家的税收嘛？这个就是争议的来源那我想这个东西，所以这个当然就是说可能还有很多讨论，但是感觉上现在大家都有一定共识那这个也是颠覆了所谓的我们传统的租税上一个非常重要的概念我们发展中国家不应该去补贴已发达国家或已开发国家或者是发达国家的税收，但是这个某种程度上是有那么一点的概念真的那第二个当然就是 CFC 我就不多讲，就是说其实这个东西就是通收了，不管你在那边有没有实质应用，我就给你收了或实质应用。那第二个就是说规则转换，你就是要缴那么多税那以前免税部分通常透过因为租税协定你可能没有 PE， 可能是等等，你这些 PE 或不动产，你因为不管任何的理由，你可能在那边少缴缴税的话，我都要给你课对不起，东道主国所得来源国可以给你课税。但是课完的税可以拿到母国抵，就是你至少要缴到15%啦，缴完15%我让你抵这个当然一个第二个概念那第三个概念就是简单的讲是 under tax payment， 就是说其实我要支付出去的时候，比方说从新加坡支付到台湾的时候你就是要你就是要支付这么多那对不起，你因为要达到最低的税负，那我想大家都知道，就是它会创造所谓的费用。那新加坡政府那边可能有权利把这些费用剔掉，费用的降低，也就是说你要税就会缴更多那第四个当然就是 subject to tax rule， 其实就是相对就是我要把这些货款或支付要付到一个所谓低税国家，比方说黑名单国家，可能是开曼群岛，可能是爱尔兰，你这个国家的税率要是显著低于我这个国家的话，我就是要给你课。那这个通常是要透过 withholding tax 或者是就源扣缴方式来进行。所以不管怎样，就是说这个东西是用各式各样的方法来达到你在那个所得来源国要缴到15%大概是这样子。来下一页。那我简单未来转换，我刚刚那个我已经讲了30分钟我还是强调一下，虽然 OECD 虽然也是有一些一致性的方案的建议但是实务上呢，每个国家还是他自己的 local rule 那我想这个还是要说，就是说实务上你要搞到数位税制还没尚未统一，大家跨境电商还是要注意，这第一个。那第二个我还是强调就是说 OECD 的 Pillar 1、Pillar 2， 我一直强调是7.5个亿，7.5个亿。所以大家想说这是7.5个亿，干我什么事，对不对？我一年有没有赚7.5个亿台币我都没有，还7.5个亿欧元。但是你不要忘了这些东西 ，OECD 电商是真的大型企业，但是中小型的电商是不是有还是 subject to 你可能要去做生意的那个国家？比方说新加坡的电商，可能他一个只做7.5个亿新币好了，但是国币新币，但是他来台湾，他还是要 follow 台湾的 rule 可能不是 OECD 上，可能是台湾 local rule， 所以这个东西还是有很多实务上的部分，请大家注意一下那第二个我还是强调，就是台湾目前当然也是有一些规定这个我们还是要跟国际要接轨了这个部分是很现实的问题。我们台湾现在很多税制上，包括我们刚刚讲那个常设机构的规定其实也是民国40几年的东西，一直都没改。台湾的做法原则上就是很多都是用行政命令或指导方式一直改。我们出了一大堆行政命令或者是解释令，但是实际上他们的母法是没有改的。这个是老实上我是觉得是有所争议，可能我们也要去改那还是刚刚强调，就是我们的税法跟商业法，你一定要朝数位经济跟那个数位经济的改那第四个还是很简单，因为 OECD 的这些 Pillar 1或 Pillar 2的部分，全世界的所有的这个税务机关，包括台湾在内，就针对相关的，不一定是 Pillar 1、Pillar 2，但是其他所谓的反避税 （anti-avoidance） 这些所谓的 CFC 但各式各样的所谓反避税规定，一定会加速，或者是会不够的地方一定会补强那第五个。很现实问题我们台湾人也很习惯用什么 BVI、Cayman 这些低税率国家做生意简单来讲，你用这些国家来做生意会越来越难，因为就是刚刚强调，就是 Pillar 2的部分，不管你是不是电商，你没有缴到15%，我就要给你课税那你既然这样子的话，我想这个就要提早一个安排那第六个，这跟第5点也是相关，就是说现在变成就是说你如何去分配你的利润，那分配的利润牵涉到就是说你的 supply chain。你的 intellectual property 要放在哪里？甚至你的 data 甚至要 locate 在哪里？你的这些所谓 data 的这些 source， 比方说你的消费者是要放在哪里？其实这个是要更多的思考方向 ，data 的 location 是不是跟 consumer 一定要在一起那等一下我们也讨论到，就是说，其实 OECD 在 WTO 也是讨论到几个重点，就是说 cross border 的 data transmission， 或是 forced localization 这个在 不是 OECD， 这反而是 WTO 一直在讨论，就是 这些相关的利润的分配以及 location 啊，我想是变得非常非常棘手，这个可能是大家要去思考的部分。来，最后啊，这张图是我很喜欢啊，不要浪费一场危机了啊，中文的哈。那 Winston Churchill，那大家看到应该是看他的2根指头，不是只看中间的1根指头。我想这个，我想大家也是因为有这样的一个情况呢，我想也是给大家机会重新思考你的所谓的电商的策略，以及国家的一个所谓的税制或是贸易政策啊。好，我现在到此啊，谢谢大家的时间。那欢迎大家问提问，谢谢。
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Nabe.
Yep.
The concrete example you provided are very, very helpful. I personally benefit a lot from your presentation. So now may I suggest that we start the discussion with the questions in the chat box, okay? As you can see in the chat box, Eunice, would you like to take the first question? Let me read through. With many countries beginning to impose digital services tax, how can governments help enterprise to adapt, especially small and medium enterprises? I think, Richard, you are also welcome to respond to this question. So yeah, please, either of you.
Yeah, I think maybe Richard is better placed to do this. I think my only response is that.
Unmute, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was just going to say that maybe Richard is better placed to respond on this, but,
Okay, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, Richard, please.
等一下，对不起，我刚刚没有注意听到问你，你可不可以再？
在那个 chat box， you can see the question in the chat box.
Lots of questions. I don't know which one I should start.
So let's start with the question. The first question is raised around 354. It says that with many countries beginning to impose digital services tax, how can governments help enterprise to adapt, especially small and medium enterprises? So I think, Rachel, because you have been advising the Taiwanese government on many taxation issues, so would you like to respond to this question from the angle of government? Being how can government help?
Okay. And obviously, thanks. And this is a very good question, but extremely technical too. Okay. Again, we spend Eunice and I spend time. We discuss about the OECD, global approach and stuff like that. But in terms of, as I mentioned in the last, OECD, yes, it comes out a standardized approach, unified approach for larger companies. So for smaller or SME, small and medium-sized company, what we should do. So my suggestion or policy is that perhaps the government should gradually, make sure that our rules and conditions are consistent with the global approach. For example, approach. And first of all, what we can do is at this stage, my personal interpretation is for small and medium-sized companies in terms of tax, we still have to rely on traditional international tax approach, meaning tax treaties. In terms of Pillar 1, Pillar 2, it is more consensus based. We don't really have let's sign a Pillar 1, Pillar 2 international convention. I don't hear anything like this. Okay, so in terms of a small and medium size, if you are not subject to Pillar 1, Pillar 2, I think the last resolution in terms of protection and how to help you out is you still have to rely on so-called international tax treaties. And number 2 is that you probably have to. We probably have to encourage our government to enter into more so-called treaties, tax treaties with other countries. I think Taiwan has shown a significant improvement in terms of a number of tax treaties. But unfortunately, compared to countries like Singapore, no, we're peanuts. So in the end of the day, I think we still have to rely on a lot of so-called protections under the treaties. And finally, I think we, the small and medium-sized companies, should take more consideration in terms of general, they have to receive more like general trainings in terms of international tax trainings. For example, if I do these transactions, do I have to create a PE and stuff like that? Because PE issues is fundamental issues which will not be overthrown overnight. having mentioned you have a Pillar 1, Pillar 2. It will still continue. But obviously, in terms of cross-trade and stuff like that, if your market is still going to a so-called developing countries such as ASEAN countries, I still believe that the traditional approach is reliable, and we should continue to rely on the traditional approach rather than Pillar 1, Pillar 2, which are more applicable to the larger enterprises. Eunice, I'm not sure your views.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that, in terms of what governments can do, you try to achieve tax certainty, through OECD agreement if you can. For SMEs, I believe, which may not be affected by such taxes, then yeah, traditional approaches like avoidance of double taxation agreements, like what my government has done quite a lot of, is probably the way to go forward.
Yeah. Thank you. But may I just push a little bit further that I think both of you respond to the question from the angle of the OECD initiative. But how about the domestic digital services tax? I mean, if the digital services tax are here to stay, how does this impact the digital competition? I mean, how are smaller players being affected, or is only matters for the large corporation?
Yeah, again, this is a highly it's a very interesting question, challenging question. So as I mentioned to everyone, that the Pillar 1, Pillar 2 again is OECD kind of thing applicable to all large companies. But again, it doesn't mean that each local jurisdictions will not give away their so-called taxing right. Okay, so as I said, yes, after Pillar 1, Pillar 2, I think French government or maybe German government, they probably will review their so-called digital tax regimes. But until the day 2023, I still think that traditional OECD or international tax rules still will be relied upon by most of them so-called e-commerce people or business people. So what we can do is obviously, again, it really depends on countries. So my suggestion to our audience or maybe our enterprises is that wherever you probably will have a target countries. So before you enter into each country, so you probably have to understand two things. Number one, what is the so-called local digital service tax first? Because I don't think it will be disappear overnight. Again, it probably will be surviving until 2023, 24, or even 25. And number two is that under the traditional international tax concept, can you still protect yourself for additional tax payable in so-called in the respective markets or source countries? So this is a question you have to. I don't expect everyone to understand this, but you probably have to rely on more, maybe, for example, professional advisors, maybe international tax advisors in the respective source countries, and maybe government can give them some kind of idea. Okay, and for example, if Taiwan government is promoting e-commerce enterprises from Taiwan and enter into Southeast Asian country, ASEAN, under the new southbound policies, perhaps government can come out more like a guidance or advice or training or lessons whatever to our so-called business people for their general understanding purposes. But after all, each enterprise should learn how to pick up and learn how to so-called domestic rules in the respective market they are going to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Eunice, anything you would like to add? I mean, what can we expect from these OECD negotiations? Because Richard's answer kind of disappointing, right? I mean, to what extent will a multilateral solution through the OECD framework lead to the removal of all the unilateral digital services tax in your view?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, this is really at the end of the day is politics, right? The French have decided, and also, I mean, when you think about negotiations, it's also to some extent, I think some governments are thinking, of using their unilateral measure as a negotiating chip or leverage even, right? So the French, for example, have said that, okay, if there's a OECD solution, then we're going to remove our unilateral measure. So I can't tell at this point, whether really all the unilateral measures will disappear. But at least from what some countries have said, it does seem that that is the path that they are thinking of taking. I mean, I would just add 2 points. I think one, in terms of how, and this also is sort of in response to some of the other questions that I see that, if this continues, right, like if there's no multilateral solution, what actually really happens? And I spoke just now, I think, about this spiral, right? Every time there is a unilateral tax measure that's imposed, you have a trade response from the US, and how can SMEs be affected by that? I think a couple of ways, right? One, when there's a trade response, when the US says, okay, I'm going to slap 25% more tariffs on French cheese, right? What happens to the French farmer, right? That's down supply chain, right? Everybody gets affected in that way. It's not just LVMH, right, that produces the bags. It's the supplier that supplies the leather, is a supplier that supplies, I don't know, the belts or whatever. So I think the larger economy needs to be taken into account. It's not just the digital companies that will be affected. That's one. The second is this whole thing about pass-through. So Google has announced that in France, the additional taxes that will be levied will be passed through to the consumer. So what in effect happens is that the prices of advertising on Google in France will just get more expensive because we have to take into account the additional taxes that we will have to incur in France because of the DST. We have made the same announcement for some other jurisdictions like the UK. So at the end of the day, it's also whether the consumer is able to whether sort of how higher costs then will inhibit innovation, will inhibit trade, will inhibit economic activity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate your emphasis on the phenomenon of cross retaliation. And also thank you for connecting your answers to the question in the chat box. So you already clear one question here. And Rachel, we have 2 more questions for you. The first is, sorry, let me read. Why financial services is carved out from the DST measure? And the second one is whether the Pillar 2 makes the investment attraction through low tax incentive become less possible. I think those are the questions for you, right, Richard?
Right, okay. First question, why financial services are carved out from DST? Okay, if you're referring DST as a local rules, maybe I should emphasize coming back to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 does not specifically excluding financial services. It doesn't really say. It just say that if you are facing the consumers, if you are largely, automatic and automated digital service. So my gut feeling, I don't really have a direct answer to this, but based on my experiences, number one, the financial services, as everyone probably knows, that it is highly regulated. And of course, in terms of digital services, we are very much focusing on so-called facing to the consumers. So in terms of facing to consumers, for example, using Taiwan, I'm sure Singapore is the same, is that in terms of how to protect consumers, how to protect consumers' personal data, which is very important. So often in most countries, you are not supposed to, if you want to directly, on massive scale basis approach marketing to my local consumers or retail markets, you need to have at least some kind of entity here in Singapore, Taiwan, at a branch or subsidiary. So if that's the case, based on personal data protections and protecting the financial interests of the consumers, often you have to be localized, regardless of whether you're a branch or subsidiary, and therefore you don't really have a so-called cross-border digital service. Of course, if individual retail consumers, they want to approach U.S. Financial services in America, or approach to private bankers in Hong Kong, Singapore, that's fine. That's your individual act. But typically, if you're talking about large-scale marketing, no way. And number two is, again, as I think that very importantly, in most of countries, for financial services, there is I wouldn't use the word unwritten, rules, but often personal data need to be kept in your local countries. It's very important, including particularly Taiwan. I'm not sure about Singapore, but again, this is a so-called cross-border data transmissions, or even you can use cloud technology, fine with me, but you have to keep your data center here in Taiwan, for example. That's a rule in Taiwan, by the way. Okay, so because of this and that, it is, instead of tax rules, I think it is more like a financial regulatory kind of restrictions. Jonas, I'm not sure whether you have better answers, because I know Google is going to make a G Bank or something, right? Google Bank, maybe.
No intentions of going down the banking route. But yeah, I actually don't really have much to add. I mean, I would just add that, the financial services carve-out was a proposal by the UK, which has a very large financial services sector. So, but no idea, sort of not privy to what happened in that room when they negotiated this, but just to flag that. Yeah.
So that's my rough guess.
Okay, thank you. So, Eunice, I think, can I make a further question for you? That because some participants today are our trade policymakers, I think we would like to hear more of your perspectives in this regard. That I think we already touched upon the issue that, for example, the cross regulation may provide some incentives for countries to agree to a set of the multilateral rules on tax. But I'm wondering, do you support idea to extend the JSI, WTO e-commerce plurilateral trade negotiations to address the digital taxation issues at this stage? Is it possible or feasible?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I think I'm trying to say that, considering the complexity of the digital trade negotiations, could digital service tax be part of the JSI e-commerce negotiations?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. My personal view is that the JSI negotiations, as it is already extremely complicated. There are tensions over, really how are you going to deal with the cross-border data flow localization issue, and adding this DST issue to that, I think will. I mean, Doha took 20 years, right? I don't know how long it will take if you add this to the list of issues that JSI needs to address. So my personal view is, I think it's probably better to keep the DST discussions in the OECD. WTO deals with the JSI, but I think what is necessary is more coordination between the two international bodies. So like what Richard said, the tax lawyers should talk to the trade lawyers, and the tax negotiators should also talk to the trade negotiators, so that there's some kind of coherence in the international governance framework. Otherwise, you start seeing a lot of these issues, surfacing again, even if you have a new OECD deal of some sort, or even if you have some kind of JSI deal. Yeah.
Great point. Thank you.
My view is the same. I mean, just make sure that trade lawyers do not mix with the international tax lawyers. That's number one. And number two is, obviously, OECD has been primarily looking after international cross-border tax issues. So if you add in additional, WTO trade law kind of concept, it probably will make the concept very, very tricky. So at this stage, I think what I totally agree with what Eunice said is that I hope there will be better coordination between the trade specialists or trade policymakers and the tax policy makers. That's number one for sure. Number two is that this will also involve in lots of politics. Okay, my Eunice just mentioned too, cross-border data transmission and forced localization is two key issues. I would say that these two issues will continue to exist, and because for reasons from one to the other, these two will be driving a lot of things. So if you are limiting so-called cross-border data transmission, and number two, you force everyone localized, then you don't need a Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Because once you localize, you pay tax. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, very interesting.
Makes sense. Yeah, yeah. I got your point. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We have some questions coming. Anyone you would like to? Any speakers would like to come in and take the question? It seems to me there's still some unanswered, right?
I can see one of the questions, Pillar 2, makes the investment attraction through low tax incentives become less possible. The answer is definitely yes. I mean, nowadays, maybe I should say that nowadays we talk about incentives are not necessarily tax only. Incentive is probably including but not limited to subsidies in terms of fiscal subsidy. Well, I give you cash, instead of the average. Economics-wise, it's probably the same. But obviously, I think it will make each country think again whether give a tax incentive is a good idea. That's number one, because under Pillar 2 situation is very difficult. And number two is that each country will probably spend more time to, for example, to think the way to attract foreign investments. For example, do I offer very cheap water and electricity? Or I will subsidize for people costs, labor costs, or I will freely lend you, a factory land side for 20 years, for example. So I think there will be different type of fiscal incentives to be appear in the market in the coming countries. But again, tax-based incentives will be for sure less and less. That's my observations.
Okay. So, Eunice, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I'll just say that, in my past life in the Singapore government.
You mute yourself, right? You unmute?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just want to say that in my past life in the Singapore government, I also, was dealing with some sort of economic development issues, and precisely, I think what Richard has said, that I think countries have to start thinking about how else to better compete apart from tax. So whether it's by stronger IP protections, for example, or through other types of incentives, that is in a sense, triggering a whole rethink of how you're going to make your own jurisdiction more attractive to investors, and not just one formula, which is like a tax incentive. So yeah, just chipping in here on that.
Great, thank you. So before we close the webinar, I actually would like to have a deeper discussion about the trade issues, because you see we have the three trade people and the tax people here, and may I have a question that in your view, what affects the digital services tax have on trading services, especially for Mode 1 trade? Or in a broader context, what aspects of the digital services tax are particular problematic in terms of international trade?
I will let Eunice answer this question.
Yeah, thanks. I think a couple of ways, right? Like one, any sort of additional costs to services trade, Mode 1, through the imposition of a DST would also have a corresponding effect on trade. Generally it's like a tariff, right? Almost like for goods, and so that has also like general dampening effects. But the other issue is also the question of how do you even define or ring fence what belongs to France, right? What type of activity is done in France or is in Germany or in Singapore? Yeah. Because the way, like just taking the French example as as one, the way it's been defined is that, as long as I'm doing this transaction in France, I am Singaporean, I am in Paris for holiday, I subscribe to Spotify, while I'm in Paris on holiday, I am actually liable, because I am in France when I'm doing this activity. So it's then it becomes very, very complicated because the national boundaries are very unclear, both in terms of tax and trade. So I think it's going to be very difficult to ring fence cleanly
Yeah.
in that way that we have done in GATS or GATT. So I think it really does require a whole rethink and re-architecting of systems. For Google, for example, like just looking at the French measure, we have had to really. It's not just the additional tax, but also the costs in terms of re-engineering our internal business, re-engineering financial reporting systems, creating new filing, audit components. So all these things, sort of add to costs, and at the end of the day, I think sort of serve as quite unnecessary barriers to trade.
Thank you. I think the scenario you just mentioned is a very good reference to Richard's slides, page 5 or page 6, the example there. Very good. Thank you. So I think it's about time to wrap up here. So I would like to invite both speakers to make a very, very brief concluding remarks. How do you view the future of tax policy or trade policy in the digital economy? Maybe Mr. Richard Wadatawapi, you would like to, can we start with you? Yep.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Professor. Obviously, it's my great pleasure to be here to share some of the latest developments of the OECD, etc. Obviously, I made a joke. Trade lawyers do not talk to tax lawyers, but of course, we certainly hope that in the future they do talk to each other, because
we are talking. Yeah.
we are talking, and it is wonderful for trade law specialists to start looking into international tax rules. But anyway, so there are still a lot of so-called uncertainties, and the legal regimes or tax regimes still evolving. And obviously, in terms of digital economies, in terms of intellectual properties, in terms of how to handle data, not necessarily from tax, but also from various other regulatory perspectives, there are lots of things that we need to focus and study in the future, in the coming years. So I think this is only just the beginning. We certainly hope that the entire research academics, international organizations, including, for example, Taiwanese government policymakers, can closely monitoring international developments, and to make sure that Taiwan's legal frameworks and relevant policies are, where possible, as consistent as global practice. That's my final comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Huang?
I think I'll just make 2 points. The first point, as what I said, is I think it's necessary to start, especially in the post-COVID world, reimagining that it's not just digital companies like Google or Apple or Facebook, but also how digital or digitalization is affecting all parts of the economy. So it's not just a digital sector, but it really is a whole of economy shift towards digital technologies. That's one. The second is I think the key word here is consistency, certainty, and predictability, both for international tax regime and also for international trade rules. And that is, I think, extremely valuable for all companies, whether you are a two-man operation in Taiwan, or whether you are Google, or whether you're Toyota, right, in Japan. At the end of the day, I think we do need consistency across jurisdictions, so as to facilitate sort of cross-border trade and cross-border activity that will benefit all the players in the economy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if my colleagues at the Taiwan CSI has anything to add, or should I close the webinar?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so we are very grateful to have you all joining us today for this webinar. So thank you very much, especially for our two distinguished speakers. Thank you, and Mei Hua,
Yes.
should I close?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.